All right, so this is Chapter 5, Environmental Systems and Ecosystem Ecology. The case study in this chapter is very important. It introduces a lot of topics that you need to know. Chesapeake Bay oyster industry. So here's the Chesapeake Bay up here by Washington, D.C. It had an oyster collapse due to overharvesting, which is what we call overfishing, except that oysters aren't a fish, so we call it overharvesting. We'll study overfishing and overharvesting in Chapter 16 later on. We'll also study a lot about habitat destruction in Chapters 11 and 12, and disease in chapters, well, kind of throughout, but a lot in Chapter 14. This chapter, we're really concerned about nutrient pollution. And so our water pollution that we're talking about is nutrient runoff in the form of nitrogen and phosphorus, or our two nutrients, that create what we call a dead zone. And where does this nitrogen and phosphorus come from? Well, agricultural fertilizers have it. It's sprayed on crops. And then the rain, if it isn't soaked in and used by all the plants, we have excess fertilizer. And then rain can wash it into rivers and streams. Animal manure. So how we raise meat nowadays is we have thousands of animals in one location, and there's so much manure, so much poop, that if you have a huge storm, it's going to run into rivers and streams, and it contains nitrogen and phosphorus and dangerous bacteria, so this is a big problem. And then stormwater runoff also can contain some nitrogen and phosphorus just from people's household uses of either fertilizers on their lawns or golf courses, or even things like washing a car in the street contains detergent which has phosphorus. And so we'll talk in a couple of pages about how this creates a dead zone. So this case study is about the Chesapeake Bay, but really in the United States, our largest dead zone is in the Gulf of Mexico. And that's because the Mississippi River drains half of the U.S. And you have a lot of major rivers that go into the Mississippi River, like the Arkansas River, the Missouri River, the Ohio River. They all drain into the Mississippi, bringing in it a lot of agricultural runoff from all the farms all over the Midwest. And so there's huge amounts of nutrients that flow down the Mississippi River into the Gulf of Mexico that create a dead zone. And so this is the one really that the AP test talks about, the one in the Gulf of Mexico. Know the definition of watershed and hypoxia. Going on to this page, we have feedback loops. So this is opposite of what it seems. A negative feedback loop is good because it reverses a problem and enhances stability. And you can see a picture here that if you get too hot, your body's going to sweat to cool you down. If you're too cool, you're going to shiver to warm up. That's a negative feedback loop because it's going to enhance stability. And so homeostasis, this is part of homeostasis. Homeostasis is stability within your bodies. It's a term from biology class. There are other types of homeostasis in our body too, like our livers store sugars, so if we don't eat one day, we can still have energy. So that's another example of homeostasis. All right, this one down here is an example of the opposite, which is a positive feedback loop, which is actually bad. So here we have an example of what's going on with global warming. Normally, our ice and glaciers reflect back some of the heat from the sun, which helps keep our planet the right temperature. Well, with climate change, a lot of the ice is melting, which means less is reflected back, which means there's going to be more heat because less is reflected back, more is absorbed, which means the ice is going to melt faster, which means less is going to be reflected back. And so it just goes on and on and on and on. By the way, the reflection of heat off of ice is called albedo, or actually off of anything. It could be off of a window or whatever, but the reflection of light and heat is called albedo. All right, so positive feedback is bad because it drives a problem further. It keeps going on and on and on. Glaciers melting, erosion. Once you start erosion, the soil gets loosened, and then it just keeps going on and on and on and on. Cancer cells multiply exponentially, so does human population growth. Those are all examples of positive feedback. Any kind of exponential growth is positive feedback. Here's a term that's not in your book, but you do need to know it. It's called the Gaia hypothesis. Basically, it means that the Earth is a self-regulating, complex system that maintains homeostasis. And this is a term that's not in your book, but it goes all along with this chapter. But you need to know it for the AP test. You do need to know it. On page 108, again, know these definitions. This is an example of a watershed. So basically, anywhere rain hits in this blue-green area, it flows eventually into the Chesapeake Bay. So we say it's the Chesapeake Bay's watershed. We've mapped all of the rivers and everywhere in the U.S. Every piece of land in the U.S., we know where, if it rains here, where it's going to drain into, what river, and eventually the ocean. So we know every river's watershed, including our own in Santa Clarita. We know that watershed as well. So down here in the caption, it talks about what fish need to live. Fish need dissolved oxygen concentrations above 3.0 milligrams per liter, which is an equivalency of parts per million. So milligrams per liter is equivalent to parts per million. Now, this is the average. Some fish, like Gambusia, the mosquito fish, can tolerate it to about 2. But in general, you have most fish and shrimp and oysters and other kinds of life will die less than 3.0 milligrams per liter of dissolved oxygen. So let's talk about what the heck is going on and how we get a dead zone. All right, so I should say actually what in the world is going on. So eutrophication basically is caused by this. Now, this is extremely important. Eutrophication is always on the AP test, always. So we have farm fertilizer or manure or even urban sewage. So our sinks and our toilets get flushed, and in the United States we have a law called the Clean Water Act that says you can't dump sewage into a body of water. You have to treat it first and clean it up and get rid of nitrogens and phosphates. But sometimes there's sewage leaks. And other countries don't have those laws, or if they do, they're not enforced. And these are poorer countries. So all of these sources have nitrogen or phosphorus. So if they're not absorbed by plants, then they're going to get washed off. And we say these are excess nutrients. The rain washes them into rivers and lakes and the ocean, which cause a phytoplankton or algal bloom. Because why do we spray fertilizer on crops? Because plants love nitrogen and phosphorus. Well, so do producers in the ocean. Anything that photosynthesizes loves nitrogen and phosphorus. So in the ocean and in your rivers and lakes, you have algae. In the ocean, you also have algae too. They're going to bloom, which means make copies of themselves because they have all this lovely nitrogen and phosphorus. Well, eventually they're going to die for a couple of reasons. Some are going to die because they run out of nutrients and they die off. When you have this algal bloom, it makes the water very green and turbid and cloudy, and it blocks the sun. So your lower plants are going to die off. So they're going to die off because of the lack of nutrients. They're going to die off because the upper ones block the lower one's sun. And then they're going to be decomposed. So these guys actually add oxygen to the water. But when they die, they're going to be decomposed, and the decomposing bacteria use up all the dissolved oxygen, which creates a dead zone. And so fish can't live lower than 3.0. And you can see from this picture in the Chesapeake Bay, it gets really low in the orange part here. It gets 1 to 0 milligrams per liter. That's not enough for fish or oysters or shrimp or anything else to live. This happens in the Gulf of Mexico. It causes shrimp die-offs, causes fish die-offs. It even happens off the coast of California sometimes as well. All right, so this is the picture showing you the process. Make sure you study this. That's why I have 5 stars here, because it's really, really, really important to study. Here are some definitions to know on this page. Lithosphere, atmosphere, hydrosphere, biosphere, and ecosystem. Know these definitions. Turning the page, we have some definitions here of gross primary production, productivity, net primary production. Okay, so let's talk first about gross. We've studied this in the last chapter, and that's basically that says that when producers photosynthesize, and those are autotrophs or producers, they make energy. But remember, 90% of it's lost to the ecosystem as heat. Only 10% is turned into plant tissues, which we would call biomass. Actually, all living things, their bodies, we call them biomass. So you are made out of